Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Duskmourn Alchemy. So this is going to be the next set that drops on Arena. I believe it's coming out later today, so I'm very excited to get my hands on it. And I'm especially excited because this set is going to be legal in Alchemy, Timeless and Historic, which, as you know, are the three formats I play the most on Arena, so always very excited to check these sorts of sets out. Now, because it is an Alchemy exclusive set, there are only going to be 30 cards in this set, so rather than going through the ones that I think are most likely to be highest impact, because there's only 30 cards, I'm basically just going to go through all of them, let you know if I think they could see play in the more powerful formats like Historic and Timeless, and if I don't think they're good enough for there, I'll tell you what I think of them in Alchemy, what sort of decks I think they could fit into, and how they could potentially change the metagames there as well. Also, for any MTGs and premium members, I'm currently working on a premium article that's basically just going to be a bunch of theorycraft deck lists built around all of these cards in Alchemy, in Historic, and in Timeless as well. So if you're a premium member, keep your eyes open for that over the next couple of days. It should hopefully give you some ideas that you could try out once this set does drop. But anyway, let's just get straight into it. So starting off here with Ethrimik Imagined Fiend, which is a really interesting design. There's a nice tension going on with this card, but I think that design is probably likely to limit where it sees play. So first of all, I just don't think this is going to be anywhere near close to good enough for Timeless or Historic. In Alchemy, I think you do get a lot of value for 4 mana here, right? You get 8/8 worth of stats, you do get a buff to your other creatures if this is in play, and then once your other creatures die, you're still left with a 5/5 as well. So if you're playing like a grindy mid-range deck, this is definitely a consideration there. But I think my biggest issue with it, though, is that it is very unfocused in what it's doing. If you want a 4-mana threat that's going to take over the game in a mid-range deck right now, I much prefer Tajik. I think that card is just phenomenal. It's way more resilient as well. Whereas this card, it feels like if you're going wide, paying 4 mana for an Anthem effect, even if you get left with a 5/5 once your other creatures die, isn't that great. So I think the best case scenario for this card is you're playing a very interactive deck, and then you just slam this on turn 4, get a 5/5 and a 3/3, then when the 3/3 dies, you still have a 5/5 to apply pressure. So I don't know, it's a cool design, but I feel like the card being not very focused in what it's trying to do makes it difficult to find a good home for it. Like I said, could see it being in an Alchemy mid-range deck, but outside of that, I don't really expect this one to see too much play, to be honest. So next up we got Improvising Aerialist, which is a pretty interesting aggro tool. So Timeless, I think this is just too slow and doesn't really have a good home. In Historic, we have seen human aggro decks be a thing in the past, but I think that archetype is really poorly positioned right now, and also that deck is already really stacked at the 2-drop slot with Juggernaut Peddler, Thalia's Lieutenant, Thalia, Sigardian Evangel if you're running Lurker, so I don't really expect this to see play in Historic either. But in Alchemy, this does seem fairly interesting to me as a tool in either aggro or convoke. So the really nice thing about this card, as opposed to a lot of the other survival cards like Kona, for example, is you really don't have to jump through many hoops to enable this, right? You can play this on turn 2. 3/2 for 2 is already pretty decent stats if you're running an aggro deck, and then if the opponent doesn't have an early creature, especially if you're on the play, or you have a removal spell to take out their creature, it's pretty easy to just attack with this and then give it flying, and then the next top card getting flying is also pretty big as well, because it means you're more likely to draw into it, and then if you're running an aggro deck and you draw, you know, a decently stacked creature, that also getting flying means that you can start applying a lot more pressure. So I don't really think there's a good home for this immediately, but if a pure aggro deck that's running white wants something to fill out the 2-drop slot, this seems pretty good there as well. And then Convoke hasn't seen too much play recently. I think you did lose a lot of good setup cards last rotation, and the mana base in green-white isn't amazing in Alchemy right now either, so especially for a deck like Convoke that really wants to be curving out on turns 1, 2, and 3, and you know, the over-reliance on Fable Passage is part of your mana base right now that enters as a tap land early is pretty awkward. So without a green-white fast land, Convoke hasn't seen that much play, so I'm not sure this is going to be the thing that really is the turning point for that deck, but, you know, that is another way that you could potentially enable the survival on this, right? You play this as a creature to Convoke, tap it, and then, you know, give it flying, give the creature on top flying. Having said that, I don't even think that's great. I think, you know, one of the big weaknesses of Convoke compared to pre-rotation is a lack of good setup cards, and you typically want to be running a bunch of 1-drops to enable stuff like Amara very early on, so I think if this is going to see play, it's most likely going to be in a low-to-the-ground white aggro deck in Alchemy. Don't really expect it to see too much play outside of that, though. So next up we got Mothlight Processionist, which is a pretty interesting card. So in terms of Timeless, I just don't think this is good enough. I feel like this is the sort of card that you really have to build your deck around it to make it good, and it doesn't really seem like there's a powerful enough thing to be doing for this to be worth building around in Timeless. In Historic, though, there are a few homes that I'm excited to try this out in. First of all is Auras. I think in that deck, Esper Sentinel, Giver of Runes, Core Spirit Dancer, and Light Paws are all lock-ins as your threats, so the Amped Raptor slot is kind of the closest thing to a flex slot, and this could be worth trying in that slot, I think, because, you know, this coming down on turn 2, even if you have no other creatures, enables you to convoke a 1-mana aura on it straight away, which first of all enables you to protect it without anything else if you have a Shard Mage's Rescue in hand, which is pretty nice. If you don't have that, you could use it to play like an Ethereal Armor, for example, or something like that. And then when you put auras on your creatures, you get more Mothlight Processionist in your hand, which is basically a really efficient way of not running out of threats, right? You can just keep playing more and more of these so that when you top deck auras, you can just keep playing more and more creatures, which is pretty interesting. However, my issue with it is that one of the main reasons why I dropped SRAM for Amped Raptor in the first place was that I felt like SRAM was just too slow. I really wanted a threat that affected the game way more. And even though there is some inconsistency with Amped Raptor, the fact that it finds your 4 of Light Paws and Core Spirit Dancer more consistently is pretty big. The fact that you can cast it on turn 2, hit Sheltered by Ghosts, exile the opponent's creature, and then you've got a big creature, or just start building on your creature is a pretty big deal. I feel like Amped Raptor giving the deck more speed was very important. And Mothlight Processionist is slightly quicker than SRAM, right? Because it does enable you to convoke your auras in play. So I think it's worth considering, but I think in the majority of matchups, I would prefer to have Amped Raptor or Hushbringer, to be honest. And the way the metagame's adapting, I could even see moving Hushbringer to the main deck. I think just my instinct is if Processionist does see play in auras in Historic, it's more likely to be as a sideboard card against more interactive heavy decks, as a way to kind of, you know, ensure that you keep producing threats to run the opponent out of removal, if that makes sense. However, having said that, I think that, you know, a card like Loran's Escape might be better in that slot because it also has some other applications against decks like Control as well. This isn't very good against sweepers, really, so it's an interesting card in auras. I'm definitely going to try it out there. In terms of other homes in Historic, obviously Enchantress has been a deck for a very long time now. I don't think it's particularly good right now, but this could lead to new builds of Enchantress, potentially, if you have, you know, we're getting a number of enchantment creatures and support in this set as well. So you could maybe run cheap enchantment creatures, then play this, and then, you know, convoke into Enchantress's presence, then keep playing more enchantment creatures which draw you more cards off Enchantress's presence, and then those creatures you can use to convoke out more enchantments. So this seems like kind of a combo enabler in Enchantress potentially. So I think out of the two homes, it's much more likely to have a bigger impact because it could birth a new way to build Enchantress, but I think it's also worth trying out in auras at the very least, just to see how it feels. Then in terms of Alchemy, I think this card definitely seems worth building around to me because there's enough enchantments that work, that synergize well with a token sort of game plan to enable the convoke, that this could be used as a way to just accelerate into some really broken turns. So we've obviously got cards like Virtue of Loyalty that you can use to create a token to enable the convoke. Then this goes into the Adventure Zone, and then you can kind of accelerate into it by convoking into it with the Processionist. You got Caretaker's Talent that just keeps the cards flowing, so you could create a bunch of tokens, then accelerate into this, create another token, draw a card, hopefully draw another enchantment which you can then convoke into, draw you even more cards. So this seems very nice in that sort of deck. You've got stuff like Case of the Stashed Skeleton that is an enchantment that creates a token. You got stuff like the Overlords as well are enchantments, so this could be a very powerful thing that you can start convoking into. You know, this creates tokens and can then be hardcast off the convoke as well. Then you've got stuff like Three Blind Mice and Dedicated Dollmaker, so it feels like there are enough already good cards that are just decent on their own without the Processionist that you could, if you make some tweaks to the list, just, you know, draw Processionist off the top and then just go crazy and just kind of have these big turns where you can convoke a bunch of enchantments in play. And then, like I said, a lot of these enchantments like the Stashed Skeleton will put more creatures in play, which you can then use to convoke as well. So this seems like a card that obviously you do need to build around it, but does feel like it has a pretty high ceiling, and I could see this one seeing play in both Historic and Alchemy. And then next up we got Solitary Study, which first of all, I love the flavour on this card, especially the Endless Corridor side, and this does seem like a pretty interesting card. It's basically a repeatable Anthem. Now obviously you don't get +1 to your toughness as well, which does make you a little bit more vulnerable to the opponent just blocking, but this does seem like a pretty decent mana sink for decks that typically do kind of stutter out in the mid to late game, right? Typically these sorts of decks that want to go wide very quickly do run out of gas, so this gives you a way to just invest your mana. And it also works very well with the previous card we just talked about, the Processionist, right? If you are running a go wide tokens or aggro deck and you do have Solitary Study and you don't have great blocks, you can just play it, unlock it, get another copy, play that with the convoke, and, you know, just cast multiple of these per turn. So it seems like it could potentially work in the same sort of deck as the Processionist as well. So I definitely think I could see playing Alchemy for sure in this sort of go wide tokens Processionist deck. In Historic, I just don't think this is good enough. We have seen black-white tokens in the past be a thing, and they do look for these sorts of Anthem effects. So If you do play black-white tokens, I could see this maybe being good alongside Intangible Virtue, maybe. You know, maybe you could move away from Wedding Announcement and move back to a Lurus build because of this card, perhaps. But we haven't really seen tokens been like a top-tier deck in quite a while now, especially since the release of Modern Horizons 3. So this could see play in fringe historic decks, but I don't expect it to have any sort of impact on the main meta. And then same sort of thing in Timeless. I just don't think this is good enough there. But this is definitely an interesting card in Alchemy, especially in this sort of Processionist deck I was talking about. Then next up we got Housemeld, which is a pretty interesting card. So I'd see this as kind of a flexible card with three main uses. So first of all, you can use this as removal in a pinch against the opponent's creature. Now obviously if the opponent's creature has a good static or activated ability, you'll still have to deal with that off the enchantment they get. But if you're just concerned about the stats and you're facing down lethal, you just need to get their biggest creature off the board to stop them pressuring you on the board. This can be used for that, but it can also be used on your own creatures, right? If you've got a creature with an ETB that you want to reuse, that the stats aren't too important, you can use it there. And then very importantly, kind of like we saw with Rezug, this seems like a pretty interesting way to ensure that you get the repeated use of a static ability on a creature without it being vulnerable to creature removal. So if you've got something like a Shieldred the Apocalypse, for example, using this on a Shieldred, obviously it does leave you very vulnerable to instant speed removal, but if you do pull it off, you then get the static ability there just constantly going for the rest of the game, and the opponent then needs enchantment removal to remove it rather than creature removal, which is obviously much less played. So pretty interesting card. I think for 4 mana and sorcery speed though, this is just way too slow, definitely for Historic and Timeless. For Alchemy, I think you would need to be running cards with really good static abilities that you want. Creatures with good static abilities that you want to then turn into enchantments. But even there, instant speed removal is very commonly played. 2 of the 3 use cases for this are targeting your own creatures, which investing 4 mana in this and the opponent just killing the creature in response on your own creature is pretty brutal. So even in Alchemy, this seems pretty clunky and slow to me. I guess the other use case that I could potentially see in the future, or potentially now if I've missed it, is if there's a way to go infinite by turning a creature from a creature into an enchantment, right? There could be some very fringe creature where, I don't know, there's some activated ability that doesn't work when it's a creature that could work when it's an enchantment. So I don't believe there's a way to combo off with this card in that way right now, but definitely let me know in the comments if you know of one. I've had a search, but I couldn't quite find anyone. But this is a card that could potentially enable combos in the future. But overall, I think if this was instant speed or if it was slightly cheaper, then it would be worth considering. But at 4 mana sorcery, even in Alchemy, I'm not really sure I like this card. And then next up we got Lurker in the Deep, which is a pretty interesting card. I quite like this one. So this is it's very similar to the Overlords that we just got in Duskmourn. So it's got an impending cost for 4 mana where you get the ETB, and then 4 turns later it turns into a creature, or you can just cast it for 6 mana as the creature, and then you get the trigger on ETB and every time it attacks. So very snowbally card if the opponent doesn't kill it. So in terms of the floor of the card, what you're getting for 4 mana if you do impend it is you get a card to your hand and a 2/2 on the battlefield, which for 4 mana, especially in Alchemy, isn't the worst, right? I think typically you want to play this in a control deck, and control decks would probably prefer to just seek 2 non-land cards, but getting a 2/2 on the battlefield is a good way to defend yourself. You could maybe try this as a creativity target that enables itself, although, in formats where creativity is legal, we generally have better options than this, but, there is some token synergies going on there. But overall, the thing that really appeals to me about this card is that it just feels like better quality impending card to pair with Overlord of the Baelmerk. So I feel like the main home I'm excited to try this out in is decks that can use ways to cheat this into play as a creature earlier. Namely, in Alchemy we've got Dedicated Dollmaker, and then in Historic we've also got Felia. And now I feel like the big issue with using those cards to kind of scam the Overlords into play was that I just felt like the impending cost on all of the other Overlords were pretty bad. I felt like Baelmerk was good, especially because it can find both Dollmaker and Felia if you're running those as well. But it just felt like the quality of the rest of the the impending cards weren't really that good to me. So I could potentially see, again, I'm not sure if this will be a tier 1 deck at all or not, but trying Lurker in the Deep alongside Overlord of the Baelmerk and Dedicated Dollmaker and Felia alongside other cards with ETBs that you can then blink to make those cards good on their own. But it just feels like, playing this on turn 4, seeking a card, getting a 2/2 in play, and then blinking it with a Dollmaker, blinking it with a with a Felia, just gives you such good inevitability in late games, right? Especially if this ends as an enchantment and then you cast Dollmaker, it's really hard for the opponent to stop it. Then you end up seeking 2 non-land cards, getting 2 2/2s on the battlefield. Then you've got this 7/7 in play. So as long as the rest of your deck is interactive, you know, you could run stuff like Juggernaut Peddler as a way to slow down the control and combo decks, and then you can run, I don't know, Skyclave Apparition that you can use to blink against the aggro decks. So I definitely think that that seems worth trying out to me, now that we have another card that seems reasonable to cast for the impending cost that actually has an impact on the board. You know, the other Overlords didn't really feel that good to me. So that's the first place I'm excited to try this out in. Like I said, again, I don't think this is going to be good enough in Timeless, to be honest. In Alchemy, though, you know, like I said, I'm definitely going to be trying this out alongside Overlord of the Bellmark and Dedicated Dollmaker, because obviously, you know, pulling that synergy off in Alchemy where the power level of the format is so much lower is going to have such a bigger impact. Obviously, you don't have Failure to give you more redundancy for the cards, but like I said, the really nice thing about Lurker in the Deep and Overlord of the Bellmark is they're just good cards on their own, right? I'm pretty happy to, in Alchemy at least, to cast this for 4 mana, get a 2/2, seek an online card, and then it will tick down to eventually become a 7/7. So as long as you're running a very interactive deck that has good counterplay to what the rest of the format is doing, this Overlord and Dedicated Dollmaker, you could maybe throw in the reanimation spell as well to give you more value when you mill stuff over off the Overlord. Just seems like a really solid package to enable you to go over the top of the opponent, and then you can just fill the rest of your deck with maybe a few cards to enable Dedicated Dollmaker when you don't have either of your key enchantments, but also just, you know, a bunch of interaction to slow the opponent down. So very excited to try this one out in Alchemy and Historic. Probably not good enough for Timeless though. And then next up we got Fear of Ridicule. So in this set we are getting a few cards that pay you off for running an enchantment creature deck. And in the past we have seen in Historic some niche builds of Enchantress that go very heavy on enchantment creatures. You got stuff like Weaver of Harmony that pays you off for that, alongside, you know, your Sithis and your Sanctum Weaver. And then a bunch of 1 mana enchantment creatures that allow you to get on the board quickly and then, you know, draw you a bunch of cards off your Sithis, gain you a bunch of mana off Sanctum Weaver. But those sorts of decks haven't seen play in years. I don't think they're particularly well positioned right now. A lot of those builds are running Lurrus as well, so even if you did want to try Fear of Ridicule in that sort of archetype, you lose Lurrus by running it. Now, if you wanted to run Enchantress's Presence, for example, as another way to produce card advantage, then you could potentially run Fear of Ridicule there, but I just don't think this card's good enough for Historic, if I'm being perfectly honest, right? It gives your creatures Menace, which does enable you to force through some damage, and the ability when it connects is pretty nice, but you know, we've gotten to the point in Historic now where 3 mana creatures that don't immediately impact the board or have a big impact aren't really playable, and this is only going to be playable in a deck that hasn't seen play for years, so I don't think this is going to see play in Historic. I don't think this is going to see play in Timeless either, so only really going to fit into Alchemy, I think. And you know, obviously there are enchantment creatures in the format right now. There isn't really an enchantment creature deck, and I'm not really sure this is going to be a big enough reason to move the needle on that. We'll see though, you know, maybe if they are leaning hard on this and some of the other support cards are good enough, then it might be worth trying, but I really wouldn't be surprised if this is a card that just doesn't see play in any format, to be honest, until we get better support for enchantment creatures. So next up we got Glimmer Hoarder, which is another survival card, but this is definitely one where I feel like you probably want to be tapping this with some other effect rather than attacking, because it does produce value over time, so the opponent is very heavily incentivized to block this if you do attack with it. And the spellbook cards are Angel of Suffering, Ephemia, Bale Merkleech, Chitinous Crawler, Defiler of Flesh, Gravebreaker Lamia, Mind Rack Harpy, Puppet Razor, and Starving Revenant. I'll have a link to this article down in the description if you just want to browse these yourself, but this does produce some, you know, cards that will have an impact on the game, so this definitely feels like a card where you want to be playing it in a mid-range deck as a way to just kind of grind value over time. Now, I don't think this is really going to be good enough for Historic or Timeless. I think those formats have just moved way past the point of these sorts of slow value effects, especially ones that draft cards from a spellbook rather than drawing cards from your deck. So these cards won't even oftentimes synergize with your proactive game plan. I just think it's too slow there. Alchemy, this does seem pretty interesting to me though, especially in a mid-range deck, because this is the sort of effect like your Dark Confidence and your Caustic Broncos that do just snowball the game if the opponent doesn't answer it straight away. And like I said with Caustic Bronco, this does work very well with the the saddle cards, right? Caustic Bronco is probably the best example of that because it's the best saddle card and works well in a mid-range deck that this could also work well in, but there are some other playable saddle cards as well. So not to mention the fact that if you are playing a very interactive heavy deck, you can potentially just start attacking in with this if you can keep the opponent's creatures off the board. So I don't expect this one to see play outside of in Historical Timeless, but in Alchemy, if you are running a mid-range deck, which mid-range does still have very good tools right now, Porcine Portent's still one of the best removal spells in the format, so I feel like if you are running a black mid-range based deck, especially if you're running Caustic Bronco, this does seem like a really nice engine that can start snowballing card advantage if you're running a very interactive deck outside of it. So next up we got Razor Demon, which is a card I'm very excited to play with. So this is a 3-mana 7/7 flying with Ward discard a card, which is absolutely insane on Ray. That's so much you get for 3 mana. So obviously it comes with a pretty significant downside of whenever you cast this spell, target opponent drafts one of these 3 cards from its spellbook, either Demonic Bargain, Demonic Pact, or Ever After, and they get to cast it for free. So you really, really want to avoid hard casting this if you can, because I think at best they're just going to use Demonic Bargain to tutor up a removal spell, kill the Razor Demon and discard a card, at which case you're at parity. You know, they've maybe even got value off the removal spell if it's something like a Porcine Portent, and at worst they're just going to use their tutor to find a combo piece or something even more devastating and maybe even win the following turn. So the thing is with this card is you really want to cheat it into play without triggering the cast trigger, if that makes sense. So there's a number of ways you can do that. I think the easiest way is probably from the graveyard. So in Alchemy we've got Helping Hand is probably the best way to do it. Then in Historic we've also got Unearth and Chthonian Nightmare, and then as we move to Timeless we've got Reanimate as well. So being able to bring this back from the graveyard for 1 mana with a card like Unearth or Reanimate does seem very appealing to me, because this card seems at its best in tempo decks where you can protect it and just use this to close out the game within 3 turns. Seems very, very effective there. So and then also another way that you can cheat it into play is with stuff like Collected Company as well. Now that hasn't really been playable in any format, it's been legal for a while, but you could consider maybe running like a Golgari aggro deck with Collected Company at the top end. Maybe also with Chthonian Nightmare if you have a lot of cheap creatures you can sacrifice as well, and some discard outlets thrown in there. But in terms of older formats, in terms of Timeless, I think this is probably not good enough to see play there. I think the big difference between this and other Reanimate targets like Troll of Khazad-dûm and Grief is, first of all, this just doesn't pitch itself into the graveyard, which means for it to work with cards like Reanimate, Unearth and Chthonian Nightmare, you need to be running it alongside other discard outlets. And if you're running it alongside other discard outlets, at that point you're probably better off just running like an Atraxa or a Valgavoth instead, because that has way more impact when you reanimate it. Because in theory, the upside of this over a card like Atraxa is that you can sometimes hardcast it. But like I said, you basically never want to hardcast it, so that's not really much of an upside. And then compared to a card like Abhorrent Oculus, that kind of fills a similar space where it's a creature that is decent to reanimate, but you're not reliant on reanimating it and you can hardcast it sometimes. That doesn't come with a significant downside, so I don't really expect this one to see much play in Timeless at all, to be honest. In Historic, though, where the power level is a little bit lower, I think there are a number of shells where this could fit in. So first of all, I'm excited to try this in a spell-heavy, interactive deck that is running this alongside Monastery Mentor and Psychic Frog, and then some number of Unearth and Helping Hand. So you basically have a lot of interaction. You have Psychic Frog and maybe something like Tainted Indulgence as a discard outlet to get your Monastery Mentor and your Razor Demons into the graveyard. You can then reanimate them with Unearth or Helping Hand for a single mana, and then still have your Spell Pierces and your Fatal Pushes up to protect it as well. And then, cards like Razor Demon, Psychic Frog and Monastery Mentor really snowball the game if they're backed up. So that's a shell I could potentially see it in. Another one is alongside Chthonian Nightmare, right? You could run a bunch of cheap creatures that are sacrifice fodder, and then some creatures that also act as discard outlets, stuff like Impetuous Lootmonger or Bloodtithe Harvester, Fear of Missing Out perhaps, as ways to get this into the graveyard, and then you can just bring it back with Chthonian Nightmare. And that seems pretty appealing, because those sorts of, small-scale sacrifice decks, one of their big weaknesses is they can often take a while to actually close the game out, and Razor Demon just as a 7/7 you can bring back with Chthonian Nightmare seems pretty sweet there, so it seems worth trying there for sure. And then in Alchemy, obviously the power level is significantly lower than Historic or Timeless, so this card should in theory be way better in Alchemy. I think the downside here though obviously is that the enablers for it aren't as good. Helping Hand is definitely good, so I think if you're running Razor Demon, you want to be running it alongside Helping Hand. If you're running white-black, you also have the 4-mana Reanimate, which I think reanimating this for 4 mana is perfectly good to be doing as well, and obviously enables you to run some other more expensive cards if you wanted them as Reanimate targets as well. So even though the enablers aren't as good in Alchemy, I still expect this to be really high impact there if you can consistently reanimate it. If you're running a deck that can enable 4 Helping Hand and 4 of the 4 mana reanimation spell, that seems pretty good to me. Historic, like I said, there's a couple of shells I want to try it out in. And then Timeless, I think there's a chance maybe, but again, I think you have to jump through too many hoops for this to be good there. So unless some deck pops up that it already wants to be running, you know, Reanimate, Unearth, Chthonian Nightmare, I'm not really sure it makes the cut there, to be honest. And then next up we got Replicating Terror. So not too much to say about this one, because I think in Historic and Timeless, Sheoldred's Edict is just a much better card, right? The flexibility of being able to take out a token and a Planeswalker is way more important than getting a Conjured Duplicate in your graveyard. In Alchemy though, Sheoldred's Edict has rotated, so I believe this is the best option. If creatures with protection like Vein Ripper become really popular all of a sudden, this could be an interesting option there. And then maybe if you're running a Reanimator deck, the upside of conjuring a duplicate in your graveyard could come up. But for the most part, I think there are just better options than this. So next up we got Welcome the Darkness, which is a really unique card. I like the design on this, but I'm not really sure it's going to be that good. So straight away when this got spoiled, a lot of people were trying to hype it up alongside Death Shadow, because the joke here is you go Shadow on 1, cast this for X equals 1 on turn 2, and then you go to 1 life, Death Shadow becomes a 13/13, you can attack in for a bunch of damage, but the risk of doing that is so high, right? If you could gain life, then maybe you could consider doing that, although you don't really want to be running Incidental Life in your Death Shadow deck anyway, but you know, there's way easier ways that you can set that up without needing to, you know, put yourself at 1 and then be dead to Bowmasters, be dead to Bolt, be dead to Flage, be dead to Attacking, be dead to Goblin Bombardment. It just seems way too risky. Like I said, there are other options. Even, you know, off the top of my head, Patriarch's Humiliation can make Death Shadow a 13/13 when it attacks, and also has other usage. I think that's my main issue with this card, is that using it fairly when you're not using it with like a combo with Death Shadow, I mean, it does scale relatively quickly, right? If we use this for X equals 3 for 4 mana, for example, 4 mana, draw 3, make a 4/4 flyer is very, very powerful for 4 mana, but I think that's just too slow for Historic and Timeless. So I don't really think that really makes the cut unless there's some other combo that I'm missing with this card. So I think the main place this could see play is Alchemy, and again, I think, you know, in Alchemy, we're obviously using it fairly, so I think this could potentially be a good ramp card, maybe, right? If you start casting this for X equals 7 or 8, then you're really pulling ahead, right? I mean, obviously, you need to get to that amount of mana and survive to that point as well, but if you are casting it for a high value of X, then you can potentially use this as life gain, right? If you go down to, like, you know, 5 or 6 against an aggro deck, and then you use this for X equals 7 or 8, you can actually use this to buff your life total, I believe. I believe you can't gain life for the rest of the game, comes after the initial effect resolves. So if you're running a ramp deck in Alchemy, this could be an interesting payoff perhaps, because you do get a big creature and you get to draw a lot of cards, and there's no, you know, Sheoldred's rotated now, so we don't have to worry about dealing yourself a lot of damage off that. So I don't think this is good enough for Historical Timeless unless there's some combo I'm missing. Let me know in the comments if there is something. So I think if this does see play, it's likely going to see play as a payoff in an Alchemy ramp deck. But either way, it's a really interesting card, and this is definitely one that's going to be at the back of my mind as new cards get added to the formats. So next up we got Anguished Recollection, which is a really interesting variation on kind of like Threatening Roar Bitter Reunion cards that we've seen in the past, and this definitely seems like one of the best ones to me. I think getting a different card type to the card you discard is a benefit in the majority of decks that want to be pitching stuff to the graveyard. So Reanimator, for example, most reanimation spells are non-creature, so using this on turn 2 to pitch a creature then increases your chances of finding your reanimation spell. You know, if you use this to pitch a land, you're guaranteed to get 2 non-lands, which is really huge if you're flooding out, which is a pretty big deal. It doesn't draw you cards, which makes it better into Bowmasters and Sheoldred, although having said that, I don't think this is probably good enough for Timeless, so probably not too relevant against Bowmasters. And then you can also potentially use this as a tutor effect if you build your deck around it. So the first one that comes to mind is maybe Charbelcher, right? If you build your whole deck with just sorceries and creatures, or just sorceries and instants, probably whatever's easiest to fit the best MDFCs in, then this can be used to tutor up Charbelcher if you only have 3 card types in your entire deck. Outside of Belcher, it's a little bit more tricky to do because land is obviously a card type that you can't really avoid in the majority of other decks. But the fact that this can be also potentially used as a tutor is pretty interesting. So in terms of the formats, these sorts of effects are just too slow for Timeless for the most part. And even though this one plays around Bowmasters, I don't think it's really good enough to move the dial there. Historic, I have been interested in finding good discard outlets recently, and this does seem like one of the better ones to get there. So in any graveyard synergy decks, I do think this could potentially be good in historic, and also, as I mentioned, you could potentially use this as a tutor in Charbelcher if you build your deck around it there as well. And then again, in Alchemy, I've also been playing a decent amount of Reanimator and graveyard strategies recently as well, and this just seems like one of the best discard outlets that you can be running there as well. So very, very excited to try this one out, and I'm definitely going to keep this one in mind for future decks if we can build decks so that this can be used in a tutor, or as a tutor effect, if that makes sense. So next up we got Crude Abattoir, which is a very interesting card. So first of all, I just don't think this is anywhere near good enough for historic or timeless. The front side or the back side just isn't really what you want to be doing in either of those formats. In Alchemy, if the front side does hit enough targets, I can definitely see this being good, but my main issue is that we recently got a very similar spell in the last Alchemy set that deals 2 damage and gains you a treasure if you're on the draw, which seems way better than this, right? Whether both cards are good depends on the metagame, so because of that, unless the metagame is just full of small creatures, I don't think this is that main deckable. And then if you're bringing in this sort of card from the sideboard, I think the upside of getting a treasure token on turn 1 significantly outweighs the upside of getting Unsavory Kitchen here, really. So I'm not 100% sure if this one's likely to see play unless Alchemy suddenly devolves into a ton of small creatures. Obviously, there are a decent number of small creatures that do see play, but I think out of the two effects, I would much rather be running the treasure generator, because getting ramp on turn 1 in red whilst killing the opponent's creature feels like such higher upside than Unsavory Kitchen. So not really sure if this one's going to see much play personally. So next up we got Eager Flameguide, which is a pretty interesting card. So this kind of feels reminiscent of Burning Tree Emissary in a way. It's a 3-mana creature that generates 3 mana back when it ETBs, but it is very restrictive. It's 3 colorless mana and it can only be spent on creature spells. And then it does also have another bonus of when it dies, you get to exile the top 2 cards and play them until the end of your next turn, which is pretty sweet. But again, it's only creature cards from the exiled cards. So this is basically a very powerful card that works in a very narrow deck, and I don't think that narrow deck really exists right now. I don't think we have enough colorless creatures in Alchemy for this to be worth running. And then in Historic, we do have a decent number of colorless creatures. You've got stuff that you can, you know, just utilize the 3 mana on immediately, like Matter Reshaper. But the issue there is you don't really want to be running Eager Flameguide, Matter Reshaper, and a bunch of other 3-drops because it messes up your curve. So you could obviously also run cheap creatures, you know, 1 or 2 mana colorless creatures, and then put multiple of them into play off this. And then Eager Flameguide does kind of work like Burning Tree Emissary, where you get stuff down quicker, but Emissary is a much better effect at 2 mana in an aggro deck because it enables you to swarm the board on turn 2 as opposed to turn 3, which is a bit of an issue. Maybe you could run this with Ugin's Labyrinth and then run the 2 mana colorless creature that discounts your 7 mana stuff. But again, I feel like I'm jumping through too many hoops to play this. This definitely feels like a card that I don't think is good right now, but as you know, maybe there's a set in future where they release a bunch of really good quality colorless creatures, and then this card could be really nice as a way to just, you know, get down on the battlefield very quickly. So basically, all in all, this seems like a good card in a narrow deck that doesn't exist yet. So definitely keep it on your radar as more colorless creatures get added to the formats. Then next up we got Chittering Illuminator, which I'm really, really excited for this card in Alchemy. This card seems incredibly powerful there. In the more powerful formats, we recently got Eladamri Korvek Dal. Still don't know how to pronounce this one at all, but I feel like this is just better than the Illuminator. Obviously, the Illuminator being able to cast itself off the top is a pretty nice upside, but the fact that you can cheek big creatures into play, kind of keep the chain going, makes me think this is just the better card, although obviously Legendary versus non-Legendary is another upside for the Illuminator, but this card is basically seeing no Historic play whatsoever, so I really don't expect this card to see play in Historic or Timeless. But in Alchemy, where we don't have Eladamri, getting to play creatures off the top of your library is incredibly powerful. I played quite a lot with Wickerwing Effigy back in the day when that was legal, and this seems just better than that. So I'm very excited to play with this card. I think in a creature heavy deck, this is just a great main deckable effect that's going to be an absolute nightmare against especially the grindy decks if they can't kill it straight away. So I expect this to be a big player in Alchemy, but probably not anywhere else. So next up we got Harrowing Swarm. So we're getting some Manifest Dread support cards in this set, and this definitely feels like one of the best ones, especially if you manage to build your whole deck around it. So 2 mana Manifest Dread, so you get a 2/2 and you get to mill over a card, and then all of the face down cards cost 2 less to flip face up that are already in play. So this is pretty sick because if you're running a Manifest Dread deck, you're probably going to be running cards like Abattoir and Oculus, and if you play this on turn 2 and you manage to hit an Oculus, you can then flip it for 1 mana the following turn, which is a really powerful curve out. And then obviously if you've got an Oculus in play already, I mean, you're probably winning if you've got a live Oculus, but being able to use Harrowing Swarm to then be able to flip all of the stuff that you've hit off your Oculus for 2 less is a really big deal as well. So if there is a good Manifest Dread deck in Alchemy, which I think there is, because I think there could be, because there's some other really good support cards that we're getting that work well with this, then this seems like it could be like kind of the centerpiece of that deck that really enables some explosive turns. Outside of that, I don't really think it's going to be good enough for Historic or Timeless. We don't really get much exclusive support in Historical Timeless for this sort of deck, and even though some of these cards do seem powerful, I just don't think they're quite on the power level to see play in Historical Timeless. So likely just going to be an Alchemy player, but with this and some of the other Manifest Dread support cards we're getting in this set, I wouldn't be surprised if a dedicated deck is good in Alchemy. And then next up we got Verdant Dread, and I think this is one of the best cards in the set, and this is another card that is also kind of built for this Manifest Dread deck. So 2 mana enchantment, when it enters the battlefield you Manifest Dread, and then if you have a second one, you cast it, you trigger the one that's already in play, you trigger the one that you just played, you get 2 2/2s, you get to mill over 2 cards, and then it also has this really powerful late game mana sink where you can just keep investing 5 mana in this every single turn and making another Verdant Dread, which will trigger all the ones you've got in play already. So this card seems decent on turn 2 if you're playing a Manifest Dread or token sort of strategy that just has crazy inevitability in the late game if the opponent can't kill you quickly. And again, it's an enchantment, so it could work with the Mothlight Processionist, and these both, you know, if you are running Manifest Dread, you're producing creature tokens, so you could maybe run a Manifest Dread deck with the Mothlight Processionist, which can then help you convoke into the Verdant Dreads to cast more of them. So yeah, I feel like between Harrowing Swarm and Verdant Dread, that there probably should be a dedicated Verdant Dread deck, whether that's with a Abattoir and Oculus, whether that's with the Mothlight Processionist. Either way, I feel like this card alone is powerful enough that it should really help that sort of deck to become a force to be reckoned with, especially against decks that don't kill you particularly quickly. Then in terms of Historic, I do think this card is worth trying, at least in Historic. I think the only place you'd really want to try it is Mono Green Devotion, just as a good mana sink, right? You get this down, you get a 2/2. It's worse than most of the other 2 mana plays that you've got, but in the late game, once you've got Nykthos going, if you haven't milled over a Storm the Festival, or you don't have a good mana sink, and you've got a Kiora, you've got a Nykthos going, being able to activate this a number of times really snowballs the game. And the other nice thing about it as well is that the milling over part of Manifest Dread is also very valuable in that deck, right? If you hit a creature and a Storm the Festival, you get to mill over the Storm the Festival. Same thing with Fanatic of Ronus and other cards that work from the graveyard as well. So I'm not 100% sure if this will actually see the cut in the best versions of Mono Green Devotion, because that deck is already extremely tight. You've already got a ton of good options for that deck. And, you know, the 2 mana slot is very important to accelerate you. I think Fanatic of Ronus is just by far the best 2 mana card. And then this card doesn't actually really help your proactive game plan much. So maybe you run it as like a 1 or 2 of that you want to find off your Storm the Festivals later in the game. To then invest mana into, potentially mill over more Storm the Festivals off the Manifest Dread. So either way, I'm definitely going to be trying this in Devotion. Don't think it really makes the cut in Timeless, because there isn't really that many decks that want mana sinks there, but I expect it to be a big player in Alchemy, and I wouldn't be surprised if it sees play somewhere in Historic as well. So next up we got Wary Zone Guard, which is pretty interesting as kind of a repeatable ramp spell on a creature. So first of all, this is going to be better in formats with fetch lands, so talk about it in Timeless first. But to be honest, in Timeless and Historic, where the format's super fast and decks are either killing you too quickly that the ramp is not going to matter, or they're very interactive and they're going to be able to kill this before it triggers, I'm just not excited for this card there. I think the only place this is likely to see play, if it does see play, is probably in Alchemy. And I could see this seeing play in Alchemy, to be honest. You know, again, a 3/3 body is reasonable. If you're playing this in a mid-range deck with a lot of interaction, you could potentially just start attacking with this every single turn without even needing cards like Bronco to tap it with Saddle. And then, you know, getting ramp every single turn is pretty decent. But again, it doesn't really have a great home right now. And I think in a mid-range deck, you'd probably prefer to run cards like Preacher of the Schism, or cards that generate card advantage repeatedly rather than ramp repeatedly, because once you've got all the mana in the world, it doesn't really matter if you've got nothing to spend it on, really. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if this doesn't see play anywhere, but if it does see play, it's likely to be in Alchemy, probably either alongside some saddle cards in a ramp deck or just as part of a mid-range deck. But again, I wouldn't be massively surprised if this one doesn't see much play at all. Then next up we got Effie Fast Learner, which is a pretty interesting card. So again, I don't think this is likely to see play in Historic or Timeless. It just seems way too slow to me. In Alchemy, this is only really interesting to me with the Seeker Survivor part, because that does potentially allow you to tutor stuff more consistently. Now, obviously the downside is that Effie is a survivor itself, so you can, you know, if you do trigger the survival on this, you can just hit another copy of Effie, which is a bit awkward considering it's legendary. But if we have a look at the survivors that are legal right now, we do have Kona, which is pretty interesting. You know, they both have survival, they both pay you off for running cards that can tap it, like your saddle cards like Caustic Bronco and stuff like that. So you could potentially run a deck with 3 or 4 Effie and then 4 Kona, and then try and use the Effie to find your Kona more consistently, and then cheat big creatures into play. But I don't really know if that's worth running the Effie for doing that. There are a number of other cards that you could use to try and find Kona more consistently. You could also run Kona alongside Discard Outlets and the Reanimation spell. And also there's kind of a tension with Kona in Alchemy where I think the best way to trigger survival right now is to run saddle cards to tap it, Caustic Bronco being the best one. But the issue then is that to make Kona effective, you need to be running expensive cards like Saint Elender and Valgavoth, and then if you're drawing them off Caustic Bronco without saddling it, you're going to be dealing yourself 7 or 8 damage every upkeep. So I'm not 100% sure. I'm still kind of working on Kona decks at the moment. So I think if Effie does see play somewhere, it could be used to tutor the Kona. But outside of that, I'm not particularly high on it. It seems, I don't know, it doesn't seem that strong, and it also doesn't really have a great home right now. So those are my main issues with the card. So next up we got Enduring Friendship, and this is one of my favourite cards from the set. I think this could be one of the best cards for Alchemy from this set anyway. So we've seen Izzet Otters, a bit in the format so far. Basically just an Izzet Spellslinger deck with a bunch of Otters. We recently got stuff like Stormcatch Mentor, Thundertrap Trainer, and then we've got stuff in the format that's been there for a while, like the Elusive Otter, Frolicking Familiar. Recently got stuff like Kitzer as well. So we have a decent support of good quality creatures that work well alongside instants and sorceries. And I feel like Enduring Friendship is kind of the cornerstone of that deck going forwards. This feels like a really big reason to be running that sort of deck. And the flaw in this card is basically just, you play it out as a creature, and even if you don't get to trigger double team, the opponent kills that, and you get it back as an enchantment, which then sticks there as kind of like an anthem effect whenever you play your instants and sorceries. So, absolute worst case scenario, you're still left with a pretty powerful effect on the board, which is good. If the opponent doesn't kill it though, and you get to double team, and then you get a second one down, that seems incredibly powerful. Even if the opponent has like a destruction-based sweeper, you still get 2 anthem effects at that point. So, Enduring Friendship seems like a really big payoff to running a deck that already had a lot of good tools anyway. So I'm very, very excited to try this out in Alchemy, and I think this could be a pretty big player there for sure. In terms of older formats, a card with this sort of, decent floor, good ceiling is typically a good sign to maybe make it through to Historic. But I think the big issue in Historic is that the major Spellslinger deck in Historic right now is Izzet Wizards, and I don't think there's really any good reason to ditch that package, because you've got Flame of Anor, Symmetry Sage, Dreadhorde Arcanist, Reckless Charge, all very, very powerful cards, and this doesn't really fit with that package at all. I don't think there's any reason why you would run Otters over Wizards when Flame of Anor is one of the best cards in that deck for a good reason. So I don't really think this is going to see play outside of Alchemy, but I think this could be one of the best Alchemy cards that we get from this set, because I think Izzet Otters is already a deck I've experimented with a bit. I think is pretty decent, and this seems like a good core of that deck, if that makes sense. And then next up we got Fear of Change, which is one of my favourite cards from the set from a design point of view. This card seems really, really fun to play with, but I'm not really sure it's going to be that good, to be honest. I think if it's selected from a smaller pool of just good creatures, then I'd be very excited for it, but the fact it can get any random creature of the mana value means the variance on this card is going to be really high, and, even best case scenario, if you go like, 1 drop on turn 1 into Fear of Change on turn 2, exile the 1 drop to get a random 3 drop, and then sacrifice this somehow to turn that 3 drop into a 5 drop. Like, yeah, you get a random 5 drop on turn 2, But that's absolute best case scenario, and there is still a lot of random 5-drops that you could get off this that wouldn't be that impactful in the game, right? If you just get like a vanilla creature with reach or something, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, this card, I really want it to be good, but the randomness of it just makes me think that it's not worth, you know, building around it. And that's the other issue as well. You kind of have to build around this for your deck to actually use it efficiently, I think. And it just doesn't really seem worth it to me personally, which is a shame because the card's super sweet. So next up we got Gilded Ambusher, which is an interesting sacrifice payoff here. So nowhere near good enough for Timeless, unfortunately. And then in Historic, there are some sacrifice decks, but they basically all run Lurus, and this is nowhere near good enough to even consider giving up Lurus for. So I think if it does see play, it's only likely to see play in Alchemy, and there isn't really currently a deck that enables this. Obviously, you could try and build around it, but I'm not really sure this on its own is a good enough reason to try and build a sacrifice deck. So it's an interesting card, and as you know, if we get more sacrifice enablers as future sets release, this is definitely one that I'm going to return to. But right now, I don't think it's likely to have an immediate impact. And then next up we got Golden Sidekick. Not too much to say about this one other than not playable in Timeless and Historic, but seems like a great addition to the Bats deck in Alchemy, which is already running a bunch of cheap lifelink creatures, so it should be easy to enable this fairly easily. It's also a cheap lifelink flyer itself, so works very well. Also an enchantment, which could be notable if you're running some synergies there. So if you're running Bats, definitely seems worth trying in Alchemy, but that sees play elsewhere. So next up we got Mangled Soulrager, which is a really interesting card. Swapping the power and toughness on creatures isn't something that we see very often, but my main issue with this card is I'm just not sure where it fits. In Alchemy, we don't have any redundancy for this sort of effect, so filling your deck with a bunch of creatures that have high toughness so that you can swap them with this and then start applying pressure, it's just going to be a really bad deck when you don't draw the Mangled Soulrager, so I'm not really sure it has a great home there. And then in Eternal formats, we have seen some effects that enable you to, you know, swap the power and toughness and then attack with defenders. I can't remember the name of it, but there's like a Bant Dragon from a while ago, like maybe an M19 that does that, and then there's some enchantments that enable you to do that. But the big issue there is that most of those decks incentivize you to play defenders specifically, and this card doesn't, Mangled Soulrager doesn't allow your defenders to attack. So this definitely feels like a card where I could be missing something, so let me know in the comments if there is some synergy with this that I'm missing, but I think the card is potentially powerful, but I'm just not sure what the best home for it is. It just doesn't seem like it has a good deck, and I'm not sure it's really worth building around without more redundancy, basically. So next up we got Mischievous Lookout, which feels like one of the most high potential cards from this set for sure, but I'm not sure it has that many immediate good homes. So I do think this does have potential in the older formats. Even Timeless, it's worth looking at because, you know, it works very well with Mistress Bauble, right? You crack Bauble on turn 1, on turn 2 you cast the Lookout, recast the Bauble. Unfortunately, you can't crack it immediately because it has Summoning Sickness, but it does enter as a 2/1, so you get 2 2/1s and then you can crack it later, which is pretty nice. But my two issues with this in Timeless is it's a 2/1, so it dies to Bowmasters, and all the stuff you bring back are 2/1s, which also die to Bowmasters, and there aren't really many decks that support it. You know, obviously a lot of decks do run Bauble, but you really need more than Bauble to enable this consistently. I think I'd want at least 12 cards that put themselves in the graveyard that you can recast with the Lookout for this to be good, and there aren't really any decks that can do that. And again, I'm not really sure it's worth building around to enable that as well. So Timeless I'm doubtful of, but it may be worth exploring, especially as we get new cards that work better with this. In Historic, though, where we don't have Bowmasters and the format's a little bit slower, this does seem like it could have potential there. I think the main home that I'd be looking at it initially in is maybe like an Oni Cult Anvil shell, for example. Now, again, Anvil as an archetype hasn't really been good for a while, and I'm not sure this is going to be good enough to really move the needle on that, but being able to replay your Chromatic Stars and stuff that you sacrifice to your Anvil or your Shrapnel Blasts or your Deadly Disputes does seem like a good way to enable this and allow you to grind into longer games. Maybe Enchantress could be interested in this as well as a way to replay your Sterling Groves and your, you know, whatever other enchantments have gone to the graveyard over the course of the game. And then it's also an enchantment creature itself, so it triggers Sithis, triggers Sanctum Weaver. And in the past, one kind of brew that I did felt like had potential, although this was, 1 or 2 years ago at this point, so I'm not sure it will really hold up, but was Enchantress with Tyvar as a way to enable you to start generating tons of mana off Sanctum Weaver very quickly. And I was kind of struggling to fit enough good enchantment creatures in that deck that are hittable off Tyvar. And this is, right, Tyvar can mill over enchantments and then hit this, and then you can replay your enchantments from the graveyard with the Lookout. So that could be another potential home, although again, that style of Enchantress deck hasn't really been good recently. So in Historic, I think this does fit into a few fringe decks. Doom Foretold is another one that could be interested in this, but as I've said, all of the decks that it naturally slots into aren't particularly good right now, and I'm not sure this is good enough to move the needle on it. But in Historic especially, this is one that is definitely going to be sitting in the back of my mind as more cards get released, because, you know, if we do get more generically good cards similar to Mishra's Bauble that naturally put themselves in the graveyard, being able to run this alongside Lurus as a way to reuse those seems very powerful. So I'm not sure it'll have an immediate impact there, but looking forwards, it likely will. In Alchemy, though, this seems very good to me, and it has a lot of synergies with some other stuff that we've been looking at. If we scroll up, like I said, I was very interested in trying out kind of like a token strategy built around the Mothlight Processionist, and I think, you know, typically you might want to be moving into black-white there and being able to use the, the Mischievous Lookout alongside that. You know, you can convoke into it off the Processionist, and then you can replay your 3 blind mice and your random other enchantments from the graveyard, which seems pretty sweet. So, and just outside of that, there are probably a few other decks that can utilize it. So I definitely expect this to be a big player in Alchemy, and I wouldn't be surprised if this does see play in Historic and maybe even Timeless at some point down the line. Then next up we got Polterheist. Not too much I want to say about this one. Not good enough for Historic or Timeless, and even in Alchemy, we've already got Thieving Aven, which I feel is much better than this because it's already got Evasion, which makes it much more likely to connect. So this is only likely to see play if you really wanted to run more Thieving Avens, right? If you're already running 4 and you want to run slightly more. But outside of that, I just don't think this is likely to see play over Thieving Aven, and I'm not sure the Grixis Heist deck wants to be running more than 4 copies of Aven anyway, so we'll have to see, but I don't expect this one to see a ton of play. Then next up we got Unnatural Summons, which is another support card for the Manifest Dread deck, and this is just a slam dunk in that deck for sure. I think you really want to be green-blue based for these sorts of decks to get access to a Boron Oculus, and then Unnatural Summons pays you off even more for being in blue. Maybe you want a third colour for black or white to give you better creature removal, but overall, you know, this alongside the Verdant Dread and the other support cards we've seen in a Boron Oculus makes me think that the Manifest Dread deck in Alchemy should be pretty real. This card seems pretty good. Then in terms of older formats, definitely not good enough for Timeless. In Historic, probably not good enough either unless you're running a deck that really cares about getting multiple creature tokens into play. Maybe that, you know, it does feel like there could be maybe like a Historic combo deck that really values this sort of effect, but nothing is coming to mind immediately for a deck that would want this. But definitely expect this one to see play in the Alchemy Manifest Dread deck for sure. So next up we got Valiant Emberkin. So again, definitely not going to see play in Timeless or Historic because it's just too slow. But in Alchemy, where the Boros Mice deck is already a pretty real thing, this seems like it could be a pretty nice addition to that deck. Now the big issue with Emberkin there is it's 3 mana, and these sorts of heroic style decks that want to target their own creatures with instants or sorceries want their threats to be as cheap as possible to not only get them down early, but also be able to protect them from removal and also start buffing them as quickly as possible. So being 3 mana is definitely a downside for this sort of deck, but I could maybe see running this as a 1 or 2 of, just to give you a little bit more top end, give you a little bit more inevitability, because if you do get to untap with this and you start getting to trigger the second half of this where you double up on your targeted abilities, it does seem very strong. But I also wouldn't be surprised if the Mice deck just wants to keep its threats at 1 and 2 mana just to keep the deck as low to the ground as possible, but I can see it seeing play as a 1 or 2 of, we'll see. Then next up we've got Wingbright Thief, which is kind of reminiscent of like Elite Spellbinder and Elite Guard Mage in a few ways, but I think this is significantly worse than Elite Spellbinder. Elite Spellbinder and Anointed Peacekeeper typically fill very specific roles in aggro decks, where against control you can use it to delay a sweeper by a turn or 2, which often buys you enough time to win the game, and then against combo you can use it to delay a key combo keys to allow you to race and win. This card doesn't do either of those, and it's also in blue as well. I think one of the main reasons why you want Peacekeeper or Elite Spellbinder in aggro decks is when you're not running blue or black, so you don't have access to discard spells or counter spells. If you're running this, you're already in blue, which gives you access to counter spells, so I'm not sure that's the way you want to use it. So I guess the way you want to use it is more like Elite Guard Mage, where you just see it as a value card, right? You play this, you target the card the opponent is most likely to play early on, and then when they do play that, you get to draw a card, and maybe you can blink this, but I don't know. I don't feel like that sort of value style of deck is that good. I don't think this has a particularly good home right now either. There aren't that many ways that you could blink this either. The opponent could potentially play around it, right? This isn't just a 3 mana cantripping effect. Whatever you target with this, the opponent can just choose not to play. So I don't know, I'm a bit confused about this one. I just don't really think it has a good deck, really, even in Alchemy, so I wouldn't be surprised if this one just sees no play. And then next up we got Soul Shredder, which is another pretty interesting sacrifice payoff. Now, in Alchemy, I'm not really sure we have good enough sacrifice enablers for this, so this is definitely one to keep in mind for future sets as we get better sacrifice enablers. I definitely think this could be a standout card once we get better setup. In older formats like Historic and Timeless, where we do have really good quality sacrifice enablers, this is an interesting card, I think, especially if you're milling a lot as part of your proactive game plan, right? If you're running a deck with Bloodghast and Stitcher's Supplier and stuff, the fact that you can mill this over and replay it itself from the graveyard with its own ability, and then it starts growing over the course of the game and it has haste and crew 1, is pretty appealing. So if you are running a self-mill sacrifice-themed deck, this does seem like an interesting extra angle of attack. Again, I err on the side of probably not playable in Timeless because of the power level of the format. Could potentially see play in Historic, but again, I'm not really sure there's a good home for it immediately. But again, you know, there will always be new cards that get released that make Stitcher's Supplier, that makes Bloodghast better. So this definitely could be worth trying in Historic in more of a self-mill style deck as kind of a secondary angle of attack. But again, the other issue there is if you're running a lot of self-mill, you probably have graveyard synergies anyway, and then this also gets hit by graveyard hate. But it is also hard castable as well. So I think my read on this right now is if we get better sacrifice enablers in Alchemy, definitely keep an eye on this as a good payoff. Probably too slow for Timeless, and then I could see it seeing play in Historic in the right shell. I do think you need to be self-milling for this to be good in those sorts of shells, though. So that's the set overall. Obviously, as is always the case, not as many of these cards are going to break through to the Eternal formats like Historic and Timeless, but there are a few, you know, there are a handful of cards in here that I'm definitely going to be trying out, at least in Historic, to see how they do. And then in Alchemy, I do think this set is likely going to shake things up. I would be pretty surprised if the Manifest Dread deck's not good. I think Mothlight Processionist especially seems like it could be a really good enabler for a number of different builds as well. So either way, I'm really excited to get my hands on this set, try out a bunch of ideas that I've already got brewed. Speaking of which, like I said, if you're an MTG Zone Premium member, keep your eyes on the site over the next couple of days. I'll be having an article go up with a bunch of Theorycraft lists that I'll also be tweaking as I playtest them, and then updating the article as I play them as well. So keep your eyes open for that. And also definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's any applications of these cards that I missed, especially for some of the weirder cards as well, because there were some cards I was looking at, for example, like the Soulrager, and also where is it? The kind of black, yeah, the Welcome to Darkness as well, where I felt like I could definitely be missing some applications of these sorts of cards. So definitely let me know in the comments if you think I missed anything. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.